I still remember the exact second my world cracked open. It was the morning after my father's funeral. The sky was gray, heavy with rain, and the house was packed with mourners who had left behind half-empty plates and wine glasses from the wake. I was in my father's study, where the air still smelled like old leather and pipe smoke, when the lawyer unfolded the will on the mahogany desk. And that's when I saw it. My name, missing. The farm, the land, the house. All of it had been left to my brother, Matthew. Not split, not shared, not passed down equally, like my father had always said he would do. Every acre, every barn, every tool we had sweated over together was suddenly his alone. I stared at the page until the words blurred. The lawyer cleared his throat. Matthew gave me a stiff pat on the back, and everyone in the room moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside, I felt the floor fall out from under me. Tell me, what would you do if your own brother stole your family's legacy? Would you fight him head-on, or would you wait, bide your time, and strike when it hurt the most? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I need to know, am I crazy for what I did next, or would you have done the same? My name is Jonathan Hayes, and this is the story of how my brother betrayed me, and how I turned that betrayal into the sweetest revenge he never saw coming. We grew up on that farm, Matthew and I. 2 boys, one older, one younger, with calloused hands before we could even ride bikes. Our father believed in hard work. No excuses, no shortcuts. I remember cold mornings when the frost clung to the barn doors, when we had to break ice out of the troughs before the cattle could drink. I remember summers when the sun baked the fields and our shirts stuck to our backs with sweat. I stayed. I worked. I lived the life my father had handed me. Matthew? He dreamed of leaving. He was always the one sneaking off, chasing girls, skipping chores, talking about bigger things beyond the county line. And yet, when our mother got sick, who stayed up through the night feeding her soup and changing sheets? Me. When the farm nearly went under during the drought, who picked up side jobs and poured the money back into keeping the place alive? Me. When Dad's knees gave out, and he couldn't lift hay bales anymore, who carried the weight without complaint? Me. I sacrificed decades for that land. My back, my hands, my future. And I thought, at the end of it all, my father would honor that. He always told me, Jonathan, this land is in your blood. One day, it'll be yours to protect. But when the papers hit the table, it wasn't my name on them. It was Matthew's. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. Maybe Dad had been confused at the end. Maybe the lawyer had mixed something up. But the will was airtight, drafted only months before his death, with witnesses, signatures, the whole 9 yards. And then it hit me like a hammer. This wasn't a mistake. Matthew had gotten to him. Looking back, the signs were there. Matthew suddenly visiting more often in the last year. Matthew driving Dad to doctor's appointments. Matthew helping with the bills. He wasn't being the good son. He was planting seeds, whispering in Dad's ear, spinning the story that he was the one who cared, that he was the one who deserved it all. It made me sick. I didn't confront him. Not then. Not at the funeral. Not in the days after. That's not my style. You see, I've learned something over the years. Anger burns hot, but it burns out fast. Revenge is patient. So I let Matthew think he had won. I shook his hand when he puffed out his chest and said, "It's what Dad wanted." I even forced a smile when neighbors congratulated him for inheriting the farm, as if he'd earned a damn thing. But inside, I was already planning. Because betrayal like that doesn't fade. It doesn't heal. It doesn't get washed away with time. It sits in your bones like poison, and the only cure is payback. For weeks, I stayed quiet. I walked the land at night, the moonlight casting shadows over fields I had planted, barns I had built, fences I had mended. My land, my sweat, my sacrifices. Matthew strutted around like a king, already making changes. He talked about selling off parcels to make things easier, about modernizing the place with money he didn't have, about putting his name on the mailbox. He thought it was his now. He thought he had erased me. But what Matthew didn't know, what he never even suspected, was that I had something he could never take away. Knowledge. Every crack in the farm's foundation, every hidden debt, every weak link in the chain, I knew it all. And one day soon, I would use it to bring him to his knees. But before we go next, I want to hear from you. If your brother cut you out of your inheritance, would you fight him in court? Or would you wait in silence, like I did, and let him dig his own grave? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, hit subscribe, because the next part of this story is where the revenge truly begins. When the shock of the will wore off, I did what I always do when my world tilts sideways. I went back to work. That farm was still mine in every way that mattered. My hands had built it. My sweat had kept it alive. My blood ran in every fence post and furrow. But legally, on paper, it was Matthew's now. And that meant the clock had started ticking. Because I knew my brother. He couldn't keep something steady if his life depended on it. The farm wasn't just going to suffer under him. It was going to burn. The first sign came less than a month after the funeral. Matthew called a family meeting. It was him, his wife, Linda, and me sitting at the old kitchen table. He pulled out a set of blueprints he'd ordered from some architect in the city. "You see this?" he said, spreading the glossy pages out like he was a CEO unveiling a skyscraper. "This place is stuck in the past. I'm going to build cabins here. Vacation rentals. Hunting lodges. We'll make 10 times the money Dad ever did with crops." I sat there silent, my jaw tight. Linda smiled that smug little smile of hers, like she was already counting the cash. That's when it clicked. Matthew didn't want to run the farm. He wanted to gut it. Sell off the history of our family piece by piece, replacing it with quick buck schemes. I wanted to flip the table, to scream that he was desecrating everything Dad and I had built. But instead, I nodded slowly, pretending to study the blueprints. Because I wasn't ready to fight yet. "Tell me, if you were in my boots, what would you do? Would you slam your fists down and call your brother a traitor to his face? Or would you bite your tongue, let him think you're weak, while you sharpen the knife behind your back?" Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see how many of you think like me. From that day forward, I started watching. Matthew strutted around the property like a king, but I noticed the cracks almost immediately. Contractors he hired quit after a week when he couldn't pay them. He leased equipment he didn't understand how to use. He opened lines of credit in town, throwing Dad's reputation around like it was his own. And Linda, she wasn't just standing by. She was in his ear constantly, urging him to think bigger, move faster, cash in before it's too late. She saw dollar signs, not soil. I started keeping notes, receipts, overheard conversations, dates, and times of meetings. Every careless mistake Matthew made, I wrote down. Every debt he took on, I logged. Every shady handshake in town, I documented. Because the more he built his little empire, the more unstable it became. And I knew, one day, I'd be the one to knock it over. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. One evening, I overheard Matthew in the barn talking to a banker. He didn't know I was outside in the shadows, listening. "Jonathan's not really involved anymore," he said, voice slick with confidence. "I'm the sole heir. My father left everything to me because he trusted me, not him. He couldn't handle it." My fists clenched. My father hadn't trusted Matthew. Matthew had manipulated him. Twisted the truth when Dad was too sick and too tired to fight back. And now, he was spreading that lie in town, tarnishing my name, making me sound like the deadweight while he was the savior of the family land. That was the moment something hardened in me. It wasn't enough to watch him fail. I wanted to expose him. I wanted everyone in this county to see him for what he really was, a fraud, a thief, a parasite living off another man's work. But here's the thing about revenge, it's not a sprint. It's a marathon. I started planting seeds of my own. Quiet conversations with old neighbors, dropping casual questions about Matthew's debts. Little nudges here and there to the contractors he'd stiffed, reminding them they weren't the only ones. A few subtle visits to the bank, asking innocent questions about loans tied to the farm. All the while, Matthew strutted louder, bragged bigger, pushed harder. And every step he took dug the hole deeper. Then came the night that changed everything. I was in Dad's old study, going through the desk drawers he used to keep locked. Most of it was mundane, ledgers, notes, faded photographs. But in the bottom drawer, tucked behind a false panel, I found something I didn't expect. A second will, dated 2 years earlier. This one split the land evenly between us, just like Dad had always promised. Signed, witnessed, notarized. Ironclad. My hands shook as I held it. This was proof that Dad hadn't forgotten me, hadn't betrayed me. Matthew must have convinced him to change it later. Or worse, forced him. And if that was true, then Matthew's victory wasn't just immoral. It was illegal. Before we continue, let me ask you, If you found proof that your brother manipulated your dying father into changing his will, what would you do? Would you march into court right away, or would you hold it close, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Tell me in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because the twist in the next part is one you don't want to miss. When I found that second will in Dad's desk, it felt like I was holding proof that I hadn't been erased. For weeks, I'd been walking around with this knot in my gut, wondering if maybe Dad had chosen Matthew after all, if somehow I hadn't been enough. But those signatures, that date, it told the truth. My father hadn't forgotten me. He had intended for us to share the land. Which meant one thing: Matthew had gotten to him. And not in some innocent, Dad changed his mind way. No, he had pressured him, poisoned him, manipulated him at his weakest. My brother hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had stolen my father's dying wishes. Here's the thing, though. I didn't take that will straight to court. Not yet. That's what Matthew would expect me to do if I ever found something like this. He'd spin his lies, pull strings, maybe even destroy evidence. And judges? They don't always side with the truth. They side with the story that's told the loudest. So instead of running to a lawyer, I slipped the will back into its hiding place, then made copies. One went into a fireproof box at the bank. Another I tucked into a folder at home. A third I handed to Robert Miller, Dad's old friend and the only lawyer I've ever trusted. Then I waited. Because revenge isn't about striking fast. It's about striking at the exact moment your enemy feels untouchable. In the meantime, I kept watching Matthew. He was moving faster than I thought possible. He bulldozed a section of the north pasture to make room for cabins. He pulled out loans he couldn't afford, mortgaged equipment that wasn't even his, and slapped his name on business cards that read Hayes Legacy Properties. Legacy. The word made me sick. He hadn't built a damn thing. But here's the irony. The higher he climbed, the easier it became for me to gather rope to hang him with. Contractors complained to me in hushed voices about bounced checks. The bank started asking me questions, since half the accounts were still in my father's name, and they knew I'd been the one managing the books for years. Neighbors noticed when Matthew cut corners on fencing, and livestock started wandering into their fields. And every time someone whispered a complaint, I nodded sympathetically, offered a word of support, and wrote it all down. Because paper doesn't forget. Then came Thanksgiving, our first without Dad. Matthew insisted on hosting dinner at the farmhouse, turning it into a showpiece for his new vision. He invited half the town, served wine he couldn't pronounce, and gave a speech about honoring tradition while moving boldly into the future. I sat at the end of the table, quiet, watching the faces of people who used to respect my father shift into doubt. They clapped politely, but their eyes told me the truth. They didn't buy it. And when Matthew raised his glass and said, "To Dad, who trusted me to carry this farm forward," I almost laughed. Because what no one else knew, not Linda, not the neighbors, not the banker sitting 3 seats down, was that I had the real story sitting in a locked box downtown. The truth. Backhand index pointing right. Quick question for you, before I go further. If you had undeniable proof your brother stole your inheritance, would you reveal it right away? Or would you wait until the whole town was watching, so the humiliation burned deeper? Drop your answer in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. After that Thanksgiving, I decided it was time to start nudging. Not exposing, not yet, but nudging. I visited the banker who'd financed Matthew's loans, casually bringing up Dad's old ledgers. I accidentally left a copy of the second will in plain sight during a meeting, just long enough for the banker's eyes to widen before I tucked it away again. I stopped by a contractor's yard, mentioning how my brother had promised to pay them after the holidays, as if that were gospel truth. The man spat on the ground and muttered that if Matthew didn't pay soon, he'd sue. And slowly, I started to feed the fire. Linda grew nervous. I could see it in her eyes every time I walked into a room. She'd always been sharper than Matthew, more calculating. I think she sensed I was up to something, but she couldn't prove it. And that uncertainty, it gnawed at her. That's when I knew my plan was working. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. It was a cold night in December. Matthew had called a meeting at the farmhouse to announce his biggest deal yet, a partnership with a developer from the city who was supposedly going to bankroll the cabin project. Half the county showed up, lured by free food and the promise of jobs. I stood in the back, arms crossed, watching as Matthew strutted around in a tailored suit he couldn't afford. He pointed at charts, waved blueprints in the air, bragged about our family legacy finally entering the modern age. And that's when I made my move. I didn't shout. I didn't storm the stage. Instead, I leaned toward the banker standing next to me and whispered just 4 words. He forged the will. The man stiffened. He turned to me, his face pale. What did you say? I handed him a folded piece of paper, just 1 page of the second will. Enough to raise questions, not enough to give away the whole game. Then I walked out, leaving Matthew mid-speech, smiling like a fool while the seeds of doubt began to spread like wildfire. But before we go on, I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, would you keep feeding the fire slowly, or would you throw the whole stack of evidence on the table and watch it all burn at once? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, hit subscribe, because the revenge you're about to hear is worth every second of patience. Revenge, I've learned, isn't a thunderclap. It's a slow storm, building on the horizon until the air itself feels heavy with it. By the time it breaks, there's nothing left standing in its path. That winter, while Matthew played the role of visionary landowner, I made sure the storm clouds kept gathering. The banker I'd whispered to at that December meeting didn't forget my words. Within weeks, he started asking questions, quiet ones at first. He called me into his office, shut the door, and slid a folder across the desk. Inside were loan statements with Matthew's name scrawled at the bottom, but the collateral listed wasn't his. It was my father's assets. Assets Matthew had no right to pledge. The banker looked me in the eye. If what you say is true about another will, Jonathan, then your brother has committed fraud. Big time. I didn't say much. Just nodded, tapped the folder once, and said, keep watching. Because the trap wasn't ready yet. Meanwhile, the whispers started spreading through town. Contractors complained louder about unpaid bills. Neighbors grumbled about broken promises. And every time I passed through the diner or the feed store, someone would mutter, your brother's in deep, isn't he? I'd smile politely, never confirming, never denying. Just letting the story build itself. The truth is, Matthew had always been his own worst enemy. I didn't have to invent lies. I just had to hold up a mirror and let people see who he really was. Then came February, when the first cracks split wide open. A supplier showed up at the farm demanding payment. When Matthew tried to bluff his way out of it, the man threatened to take him to court. Neighbors overheard. By that evening, half the county knew Matthew was broke. I sat on my porch that night, sipping coffee, watching the glow of Matthew's farmhouse across the field. I could almost hear the panic rising in his voice as he argued with Linda inside. She had wanted easy money, not this mess. And me? I felt a calm I hadn't known in months. Because the more he flailed, the less I had to do. Still, I wasn't about to leave everything to chance. I went back to Robert Miller, the lawyer I trusted, and laid the second will in front of him. He studied it, compared it to the new one Matthew had pushed through, and shook his head. Jonathan, he said slowly, this older will is valid. Legally, you should have half. Maybe more if we prove undue influence. But I'll warn you, the court process is messy, and Matthew will fight like hell. I leaned back in my chair. Good, I said. Let him fight. That's when he makes the biggest mistakes. Backhand index pointing right, quick pause for you. If you were me, would you have marched straight into court with that will, or would you keep waiting, letting your brother bury himself deeper before striking? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know how many of you believe patience makes revenge sweeter. By March, Matthew was desperate. He started selling equipment off the farm, sometimes for half its worth, just to scrape together cash. Word spread that he was behind on taxes. Even Linda stopped showing up at social events, embarrassed by the rumors swirling around their name. And then, the sweetest part, people stopped calling it his farm. They started saying, the Hayes farm is going under. Not Matthew's farm. The Hayes farm. My farm. Dad's farm. Our name tied to the ruin he was dragging it into. That's when I knew it was time to step in. I didn't do it with fireworks. I did it with precision. First, I quietly approached a few of the contractors and suppliers Matthew had burned. I offered to cover part of what he owed, small amounts, just enough to buy goodwill, if they agreed to share their paperwork with me. Signed contracts, bounced checks, forged signatures. Every scrap of evidence went into my growing file. Next, I nudged the banker again, this time showing him the second will in full. His eyebrows shot up. Jonathan, he said, this changes everything. I told him to keep it between us for now. But I could see it in his eyes. The man was already distancing himself from Matthew. And finally, I started meeting with neighbors. Over coffee, at the co-op, on church steps. I didn't accuse Matthew outright. I just asked questions. Has he paid you yet? Did he mention how he's financing those cabins? Did you know Dad had a will before the new one? By the time spring came, Matthew's reputation was hanging by a thread. But he was still arrogant, still convinced he could bluff his way through. In April, he held another big meeting at the farmhouse, this time with potential investors. He wore another shiny suit, poured expensive wine he couldn't afford, and pitched the cabins again like nothing was wrong. I was there, leaning in the corner, silent. And when one of the investors asked, "What about the outstanding debts? The liens on the property?" I watched Matthew's smile falter for the first time. He stammered, shifted, tried to redirect. That was my cue. I stepped forward, laid a folder on the table, and said, "Maybe they should see this before they make any decisions." Inside was a neat stack. Bounce checks, debt notices, and at the very top, the second will. The room went silent. One of the investors muttered, "Jesus Christ." Another pushed his chair back and left without a word. And Matthew? He looked at me with pure hatred in his eyes. For the first time, he realized I hadn't been blind. I'd been watching, waiting, collecting. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were standing in that room, would you have dropped the hammer right then and there, or would you have let him twist a little longer? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button, because the ending to this story is worth the wait. When the investors walked out of that farmhouse meeting, they didn't just leave Matthew. They took the last thin thread of his confidence with them. He was exposed, and for the first time since Dad's funeral, the village began to see the man who had always been hiding behind a smile. The thing about revenge, about doing it right, is that the last step has to be both inevitable and irreversible. You can humiliate a man in a room full of people, but if you want the world to actually change, you have to lock the doors that let him step back onto the stage. I had the keys. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Robert and the banker, with quiet court filings and precise legal language that left little wiggle room. We filed a petition challenging the validity of the later will on grounds of undue influence and incapacity, two words that pack a punch when you can prove them. We produced witnesses who could testify to the suddenness of Dad's change of heart, the pressure Matthew had applied, the long, unusual hours Matthew had spent with our father at the nursing care facility. We had the second will, witnessed and notarized years before. We had ledgers and receipts showing money Matthew had moved, and we had contractor statements that tied unpaid work directly to his cash flow problems. I'll spare you the legal minutiae. Courtrooms are full of paper and procedure, but here's what matters. The judge didn't like Matthew's story. She didn't like the idea that a man could quietly rewrite the life his brother had given him, that he could take what wasn't his through charm and a stack of forged promises. The ruling came on a gray Tuesday, and when Robert called me with the news, I felt something crack open and let out a sound that had nothing to do with triumph. It was a long, exhausted exhale. The court declared the earlier will valid and reinstated our father's original intent. The farm to be split, the house and barns to be held in trust in ways that protected the land from being sold off recklessly. It also placed liens where they belonged and ordered Matthew to account for funds he'd misapplied. There were damages. There were fines. There were deadlines that required him to produce ledgers and receipts he'd never kept, because he'd never wanted his life to be seen closely. But the legal victory was only part of the last act. The other part happened in small, human ways that carried a weight no court document ever could. After the ruling, suppliers came knocking again, but not with threats. They asked to negotiate. Contractors called to offer to come back and finish projects. Neighbors I'd known since boyhood stopped me at the co-op and said things like, "John, we're glad the farm's getting steadied. Your dad would have liked that." Those words, ordinary as they were, felt like a salve. The land wasn't just mine by blood, it was mine by community. That mattered. Matthew tried to counterattack, of course. He filed appeals, hired a flashier lawyer for a while, even tried to sell off a few pieces of equipment and a parcel to cover immediate debts. But when you've been exposed, when the ledger of your life reads like a confession, investors won't touch you. Banks won't extend credit. People remember who pays and who doesn't, who shows up in a crisis and who dries up. I didn't seek to ruin him beyond what the law and the truth deserved. I wanted the land protected and my father's name honored. Still, the consequences were real. He lost the cabin vision when the county planning office flagged unresolved liens. He lost the confidence of the men who had once drank with him under the feed room lights. Linda left, quietly, packing her things one afternoon while he tried to bargain her back with promises he couldn't keep. Rumors spread, cheats, shortcuts, lies, and they clung to him like burrs. There were ugly moments. He came by the house once, late and angry, pounding on the door like a child demanding candy. I opened it because the house is a home and because blood is stubborn. He stuttered apologies, then accusations, then threats. Eyes rimmed with red. He spat out that he'd been taking care of things, that he'd sacrificed for the family in ways I couldn't understand. I listened. It's a strange thing, listening to the man who gutted you try to act wounded. I told him two truths, slowly, so he couldn't miss either one. You stole from Dad when he couldn't stand up for himself. That's not honorable. You second-guessed your brother, and you lost sight of the soil that fed you. There are consequences for that. The look on his face was a mixture of hatred and pleading. He begged for a job on the farm. "Just so I can make amends," he said, then flinched as I didn't answer immediately. I offered him a place to sleep that winter. I let him come in to help with chores for a while, because the animals needed attention and because revenge that destroys the rest of your life tastes bitter even to the avenger. He worked under my eye, a man learning the rhythm of honest labor again. Sometimes he mumbled about fairness and destiny, and sometimes he quietly asked if I had seen Emma lately. Emma. That child had been the tipping point for me for more than one reason. I'd seen her as proof that there was still hope inside Matthew somewhere. After everything, I wasn't cruel enough to cut a child out of what was rightfully hers. We set up a college fund for her, one part because it was just, one part because it felt like a tether that might pull Matthew toward something better. I funded it not as a weapon, but as a stake in the future, because punishment without restoration is just bitterness. Rebuilding the farm was the slow work of seasons. We repaired fences in the spring, replaced boards in the old milking parlor, replanted a barley patch on the north field. I took on apprentices, younger men who wanted to learn honest tradecraft and who wanted to see land stewarded with respect. Watching them learn, seeing their hands grow calloused, hearing their laughter as they fixed a stubborn gate, was one of the best rewards the whole affair gave me. It replaced the hollow victory with something living. People asked me if I felt vindicated. I don't think that's the right word. Vindication is a public heat that cools quickly. I felt, mostly, relief. Relief that the farm would remain a farm. Relief that the truth had been rescued from the place Matthew had tried to bury it. Relief that Dad's name had been honored. Sometimes, in the dark after a long day, there was a small, private sweetness when a neighbor mentioned the lines of field Dad always liked. That sweetness was enough. There were nights, though, when quiet would creep in and the old ache would return. I'd pull Dad's coat from the closet, hold it to my face, and remember the sound of his laugh. Then I'd look at the fields and see the work that still needed doing, the seasons that still needed to turn. Revenge had been the remedy for a particular poison, but it didn't stitch the missing pieces back into people who'd been lost to greed. And that's important, I think. The point of what I did was never to destroy my brother. It was to make the land and the community whole again. In patching the farm, I kept a measure of mercy. When Matthew showed real contrition, I let him work. When he slipped back into old patterns, I enforced boundaries. Holding both firm is harder than breaking a man. It's more exhausting, and sometimes even more painful. But it's also more humane. In the end, if you ask me whether I'd recommend this path to anyone, I won't give platitudes. Blood is messy. Law is slow. Waiting is painful. But sometimes patience yields a finality that direct violence or immediate anger never can. Letting truth find purchase and holding it steady until the world sees it changed the outcome. It saved the land. So what now? I run the farm with a quieter heart. I teach the apprentices. I've taken a small room in the house where Dad kept his tobacco pipe, and I use it as a little office. The mailbox still reads Hayes and Sons, intentional, because the word sons is still aspirational. Maybe someday Matthew will earn it back. One last thing before I sign off. If you're watching this and you've ever been betrayed by someone close, family, friend, partner, ask yourself what you want more, blistering revenge or lasting repair. There's no easy answer, but there is one that keeps your hands useful for work that matters. If you like this story, hit subscribe and drop a comment. What would you have done if your brother pulled the trap I walked into? Would you go to court immediately, or would you wait like I did? I read every comment, and I want to hear your thoughts. Because in the hours when I walk those fields and feel the furrows under my palm, I understand something my father told me once with a tired smile. Land forgives the man who learns to work it honestly. I took back what was ours, yes. But the real victory was learning to keep working for what matters so greed doesn't get a foothold again. Thanks for listening. Part of me almost wishes this was a story with a cleaner ending, a neat bow, and a single lesson everyone could take to heart. But life is messy, and so are families. If nothing else, remember this: sometimes patience is the fiercest kind of loyalty.